We all have too much stuff. Or maybe it's just me. Whether you paint miniatures or not, this is a feeling that a lot of us can relate to. Like many brave souls in the LEGO hobby, when I buy a new box of miniatures, I don't always think of it as a single model kit, but instead as more of a collection of parts that I can use for all kinds of things. However, there is such a thing as space limitations, as well as just holding on to stuff that is no longer useful to us. So today, I'm going to sort through my collection, see just how many unpainted miniatures I actually have, and hopefully identify some things that I no longer need and can pass on to others. Welcome to my miniature collection. Last year, I challenged myself to complete the entire Indomitus box along with this limited edition Sisters of Battle box before the end of 2020. And while I didn't entirely succeed, I did come pretty close. I currently have just 6 Necrons left to finish painting from that project, which I think is pretty good. However, I also have these 2 standalone figures I bought individually, this 20 figure set that I bought a while ago for test schemes, a bunch of extra Sisters of Battle, the limited edition Amalia Novena, as well as the 24 Tyranids that I still need to paint, which brings our unpainted figure total up to 64 unpainted figures. Honestly, that's not too bad, and I feel like my 40k collection is pretty under control. In addition to this, I might just have some very special retro 40k sets that I intend to paint later this year on the 20th anniversary of these sets. Adding these in, this brings our total up to 115 figures. The Soul Wars box set was my first foray into Warhammer. This is where it all started for me, and this is one of the sets where I actually painted one of the armies inside, the Night Haunt. I did paint a few of the Stormcast, but ultimately they weren't really my thing, and I ended up using them more as test models for other paint schemes. However, for reasons, I ended up buying quite a few more of these starter style sets, as well as several issues of Mortal Realms magazine, which comes with the figures. And after organizing all of these sprues, half-built figures, and other things, the total comes to 77 unpainted Stormcast and 135 unpainted Night Haunt. I do intend to paint all of these Night Haunt at some point, maybe in a huge batch, like paint 135 Night Haunt in 24 hours challenge or something like that. But the Stormcast I might just continue to use as test models or eventually sell. Next up, we have my Goblin and Squig collection. Loon Curse was my next big purchase after Soul Wars, and I split the box with someone else, giving me actually 2 of the Goblin halves of the box and none of the Sylvaneth. I painted the majority of these figures, giving most of them away as Patreon rewards, and used the rest as parts to build my Grotbag Scuttler's Force. So here's where things get a bit complicated. I bought quite a few Goblin sets, as well as some 40k Orc sets to convert this army, and they're currently all mixed together in a big pile of Orc bits. So I'm not exactly sure how to count these, because the point for me of building Orc and Goblin stuff is that I want to be constantly kit bashing it, and always have lots of parts on hand to build whatever I want. And one of the things that's helped me reduce this amount of parts that I need constantly on hand has been 3D printing. Instead of trying to organize and keep every single potential part I may need in a bits box, I now have the option to just print whatever part I need, in whatever size I need, and to make as many of them as I want. Which brings us to the sponsor of today's video, My Mini Factory. My Mini Factory is quite simply the largest marketplace of STL files in the world. Whenever I'm looking for a specific part or model for a build, the first place I check is their website. They have a massive library of independent designers creating printable miniatures, terrain, vehicles, and pretty much anything else you could want. Many of my favorite sculptors and companies are already using them as their main store hub, with more and more being added each day. But one of the nicest things is there's a ton of free stuff on there too, and once you have an account, you can start accumulating a library of all the 3D files you own and keep them nice and organized, unlike my studio space. One of the most exciting things that I'm looking forward to following along with is the launch of their new crowdfunding platform, which is built right into the site. So unlike other ways to crowdfund your 3D miniatures things, everything is all in one place instead of being spread out over several websites. My mini factory has just a ton of features, more than I could fit into this tiny ad spot. But the main point that I want to get across is whether you are a 3D sculptor or someone who just wants to find all kinds of 3D stuff to print, it's definitely worth giving them a look. And if you want to let them know that I sent you, you can click on the link down below in the description. Anyway, the point is I have way too many goblin and orc parts, so I'm just going to estimate and say it's maybe 30 models worth of figures at least, and we'll add that to our ongoing pile of shame count. In addition to this, I have this new in-box set of goblins from the year 2000, which I do want to paint at some point, as well as 3 goblin wolf riders to add to our total. Feast of Bones was the next big purchase I made from Age of Sigmar. I painted all of the Ossiarch Bonereapers inside and traded away the ogre half of the box. Much like the goblins, many of the small Bonereapers got sent off as Patreon rewards, so I actually ended up buying another box of Mortek Guard, which I still have a few left to finish painting and mail off as overdue Patreon rewards. I'm really sorry, guys. Aether War. I bought this set on impulse when I had too much money and too little self-control. I was commission painting a Tzeentch army at the time, and I was really thinking I might start my own Tzeentch army alongside that, but it just never quite materialized. I've used some of the Kharadron Overlord's parts from this set for kit bashing, but otherwise we can consider this yet another 18 models on my pile left to paint. When Broken Realms Morathi came out, I was obsessed with the Daughters of Cain and the idea of building an army for the new United Dark Elf city of Har Kuron. I bought a ton of sets for this project and plan to kit bash them all together to make them look like a civilian militia type force, where each individual model looks slightly different than the others. But of course, I never actually ended up doing any of that, leaving me with yet another pile of 69 miniatures left to paint. However, I think this is actually one of these projects that has a higher chance of me returning to it one day. I bought both Warcry starter sets, as well as the very stylish Start Collecting box for the Chaos Knights. I have painted some of the Warcry warbands inside and assembled all of the terrain, but I still have a lot of work to do on this project. I currently have 73 individual pieces of Warcry terrain to paint, as well as 50 individual Chaos models left to paint. I do plan on doing all of these eventually, and I'm hoping to maybe lump together all of the Warcry warbands into one big Chaos army at some point in the future. Finally, I have 2 boxes of Cursed City, one sealed in plastic, and one fully assembled and ready to paint. Don't ask me how I ended up with 2 of these, it's an extremely shameful story, but anyway, here's another 120 models to add to my pile of shame. As some of you may know, I'm currently involved in a challenge called the Tale of 6 Warlords, where me and 5 of my friends challenged each other to build some old Warhammer Fantasy Battles armies. I sent the Orc half of the starter set to Tyler, and he sent me almost an entire other Empire half, along with some Empire Knights. And after counting up all of what I had, plus what he gave me, I have 55 Imperial models left to paint, which I plan to supplement and kit bash with 3D printed parts to complete the army. Star Wars Legion was the game that got me into army building type games in the first place. I actually bought 2 of the original box sets for this game before I ever got into Warhammer at all. Out of these, I painted way more than half, and I currently have 1 unit of Rebels left to paint, 2 units of Stormtroopers, 1 set of Barricades, as well as a few hero models. The final count is 31 models, and I do think I'll get back to this game at some point, because Star Wars is very near and dear to my heart. Last year, I got really into collecting retro models for some reason, and I bought a ridiculous amount of vintage Lord of the Rings stuff. The majority of this stuff is from a very generous mutual on Twitter, who sold a lot of it to me for a really good price, but I also bought a bunch of stuff on eBay. Out of all the Lord of the Rings stuff that I bought, I only painted 2 of the models, which means I have 181 of them left to paint. Speaking of retro models, one of my passion projects is to eventually collect and paint a full set of D&D Chainmail models. I'm currently just a few models away from having a complete set, and I promise to do a video on it when I have that complete set. Unfortunately, this also adds another 179 models to my total. Finally, I have a few special sets to show off to you. You might have noticed these in the background of some of my videos. I have one complete in-box, never assembled starter set for Gorka Morka, as well as one other box set that is still sealed in its original plastic. I'm sure we'll see more about these sets at some point in the future. In addition to everything else, I also have like a metric ton of Dungeons and Lasers kits to make terrain with. I'm not exactly sure how to count these, as I could build them into any number of terrain pieces that I might want. I'm going to say I could make at least 200 pieces of terrain eventually with these kits, including ones we have built but not yet painted. So just how many unpainted miniatures do I actually own? Well, according to my spreadsheet, it's somewhere around 1,500 figures. It's not nearly as bad as I imagined, and I think the majority of this stuff I will get around to using someday, but it is an indication that I have a problem. Because while counting all this stuff, I noticed a disturbing pattern. And that is that the majority of my unpainted miniatures seem to be from either limited edition box sets or amazing deals that I found on eBay and just couldn't pass up. The basic issue is that I seem to have a fear of missing out on things that are of a limited nature. It's something that I want to be more aware of going forward, as I do live in a pretty limited space and I can't keep adding stuff to it forever. So what's the solution? Do I just aim to stop buying things until I paint everything I have? Well, no, I don't really think that's the right solution for me. Instead, I'm aiming to use a game system that I've devised to just make sure I'm always painting more than I'm buying, to make my pile eventually smaller and smaller. I'll get to this game system in a future video, but it's based on something called Backlog Golf. So if you're interested, you can go ahead and look that up, or wait for my eventual video explaining my homebrew rules for miniature painting golf. Before we go, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to my generous patrons on Patreon. And today, I would especially like to thank Sugar Candy Miniatures, Justin Young, Wob Powell, Lobelia Sackville-Beggins, Darren Burdock Ladder, and Julian Caston. Thank you so much, I couldn't be doing this stuff without you. What? Oh, right, I almost forgot.